So Columbia University has essentially capitulated to the Trump administration's demands, and with implications for the future of Columbia and other American universities that are really would be very far-reaching. We don't know the full repercussions yet, but I think it's just important to understand that although Donald Trump is doing this because he wants to domesticate and cripple universities, just because they could be centers of resistance and critical thought against his authoritarian rule, in the same way that he wants to cripple and domesticate independent media or law firms that might sue him or the Justice Department that might be independent of his control, all these things, even though that's clearly Trump's motivation, his ability to use anti-Semitism effectively rests on the fact that there is a discourse about anti-Semitism that has existed long before October 7th, but been intensified since the October 7th massacre, that has been endorsed by many, many Democrats, and therefore makes them kind of complicit in this. And I think the critical thing we have to understand about what's wrong with this discourse of anti-Semitism, which has helped to lead us to this place, is not that it's wrong to be very concerned about anti-Semitism. Of course, we should be very concerned about anti-Semitism. The problem is that when you discuss anti-Semitism in the context of the Israel and Palestine conflict, where there are two national groups there, one has to pair it with a conversation about anti-Palestinian bigotry, right? That talking about anti-Semitism in the context of Israel-Palestine is fundamentally different in that way than talking about it in the context of white nationalism or some other historical episode. In this case, the question is, how are people treated fairly and equally? Are they being discriminated against because of their position and relationship to this relationship between Israeli Jews and Palestinians? But one naturally has to ask the question about the other group as well, about Palestinians. If you think that Palestinians are people who deserve the same treatment as Jews, right? And so if one imagined that the conversation about anti-Semitism was paired with a conversation about anti-Palestinian bigotry, I think the conversation about anti-Semitism would have to be radically different, right? Because when one asks the question, do Jewish students feel uncomfortable or even unsafe when they hear slogans like Palestine will be free from the river to the sea or globalized intifada, one would also have to ask the question, how does it make Palestinian students feel when they hear the slogan, I stand with the IDF or Israel has the right to defend itself, right? And when we ask the question of about harassment, are there Jewish students who are literally being targeted for wearing kippot or other things, right? We would also ask the question, are there Palestinian students who are being targeted for wearing keffiyehs? Because I suspect that if there are Jewish students tragically walking around Columbia's campus or other campuses who get yelled at because they're wearing kippot or they're wearing Star of David or whatever, I think it's pretty good guess that they're also Palestinian students who are getting yelled a terrorist or all kinds of nasty things, right? If they're wearing a keffiyeh. If we thought about the rules about protest, right? One of the things that Trump wants to do, but these universities have been doing ever since October 7th is really clamp down on the rules around protest. We would have to ask the question, not just are Students for Justice in Palestine violating these new, very onerous rules about protest, but are the Students United, is the pro-Israel group violating those rules of protest? If we had task forces, right, to look at anti-Semitism, then we would also have task forces, not just on Islamophobia, but task forces on anti-Palestinian bigotry, right? Because it's a different thing than Islamophobia. Most Muslims are not Palestinian, and not all Palestinians are Muslims. And if we imagined a world where we did all of those things, where we asked the question of we asked, is there bigotry towards Palestinians at the same time as we asked the question towards, do we have bigotry towards Jews? Then, in fact, the entire anti-Semitism conversation would be completely different, right? Because if one had to concede that starting to censor a phrase like globalized intifada might also mean you had to censor the phrase I stand with the IDF. And if you had to take the risk of an anti-Palestine task force, stopped with a lot of Palestinian professors and think about what they might recommend in terms of changes to the university, right? Or if you had to apply these rules around protests equally, and you began to think about the way that would impinge on the rights to protest of pro-Israel students, in fact, then all of a sudden, a lot of the push that's being made for what universities should do would disappear, right? Because people would realize almost immediately that if it was applied equally to Palestinians, it would start to infringe upon them, right, in ways that would be really problematic. It would force people to actually start to think about the importance of free speech, including free speech that makes people uncomfortable, right? The only reason that you have this push to be so draconian in terms of academic freedom, in terms of rights to protest, is precisely because no one ever imagines that it might be these principles might be applied, right, to students who are accused of anti-Palestinian bigotry. And of course, that's because we have no language of anti-Palestinian bigotry in mainstream American political conversation, because it's simply assumed that Palestinians should be treated as inferiors. There's no expectation that they would be treated equally in Israel and Palestine, where the vast majority of members of Congress are very supportive of the idea of a state based on Jewish legal supremacy. And similarly, there's no expectation of that in the United States, right? But if there were that expectation, then everything that has happened with the debate about anti-Semitism and the way it's now being used to really crush academic freedom and independence of universities just simply could not play out the way it is, right? It's only because of the way in which Palestinians simply don't count in this conversation that we can have the kind of conversation about anti-Semitism that has led us into such a disastrous place.